It's Columbus Day, and given that, thought it would be fun to check out some of the latest news revelations that have happened related to Christopher Columbus. I actually hadn't seen this at all, Lucas, so I'm glad you brought it to my attention. I so now there's a new documentary that's been released apparently, and they did some testing. They went and dug up the grave robbers, sampled DNA from 500-year-old remains of Christopher Columbus, and found that he was a Sephardic Jew from Western Europe. And you were not surprised by this at all, correct?
Not in the least. Although I think there was also a discussion or a fight by different churches in Spain and Malta. I think he might be in Malta, is where I believe Christopher Columbus is buried. Either that or a church in Malta had had claimed his remains. I think he got moved around quite a few times. But no, not a surprise to me at all, nor many of the conquistadors. And if you dig into the history of the time, if we go back out and back out of American history and hop on over to Spain, the Inquisition was going on at the time of the Spanish the Spanish conquest, their discovery of the Americas. And the Inquisition had everything to do about a European reaction, a Spanish reaction to immigration from North Africa. And North Africa was not only Islamic or Muslim people who were hopping across the Strait of Gibraltar, but also many Jewish people, many Sephardic Jews were coming up and over too. So at the time of Christopher Columbus's journey to seek trade routes to India, it was actually illegal, unlawful to be Jewish and be in the country of Spain. So not a surprise to me at all. And New Mexico also has a crypto Jewish heritage, and they say crypto because the people had to keep their identity secret and maybe make true or unfelt pledges of loyalty to the Catholic Church at the time. So, yes, here we have a page of talking about some of the Jewish heritage of families in New Mexico. Do you know much about the conquistadors?
So they were middle class, I think, right? Is that correct?
Lower class, actually. And this is part of, I think, helps to understand. It helps to understand the actions of the conquistadors. Maybe certainly not forgive them, but to understand the actions of the conquistadors. Whenever you start digging into the situation that was going on in Spain at the time. So you have the Inquisition. I think we all are familiar with stories of the Inquisition. I also talk about our inquisitorial justice system as opposed to an adversarial justice system. And this all goes back to religion and church and state. But in Spain at the time of Columbus's journey, there wasn't upward mobility for poor people in Spain. And so what they did, rather than try to work their way up through some sort of meritocracy or get a job and a house and a villa in Spain, they hopped on ships and they went around the world and they plundered. This is this notion of colonialism. If you don't have social upward mobility at home, you've got to leave your country to find it elsewhere. And so many of the conquistadors were from, uh, actually, I believe Columbus, I'm not sure if Columbus was from, but many of them were from Trujillo, Spain. And in New Mexico today, we have many Trujillos. And that goes back to a place name that they took from the area that they were leaving. They're not all those conquistadors were necessarily related, although many brothers and cousins came over, but they were the lower class from countries, towns in Spain, and they were seeking to go out and win treasure, win lands, and bring them back to the king and queen.
This was kind of like what was going on with the Vikings too, right? Like they would go out and plunder as a way of gaining wealth and status.
So great in a way, yes, but no, actually I would say very very different, because the Vikings, they were going out to, the Vikings were attacking both, or the Norsemen were attacking England and the lands to the south, but they had in their mind that they were going to pick up and go back home. We there's this narrative in the Americas, or in the United States, whatever, in the world. There's this narrative in the world today that Columbus discovered America. He didn't discover America. The Vikings were certainly aware of the Americas, and had settled in, not they hadn't settled, they had lived for a time, maybe even as long as what, like 20 years, maybe even longer than that, up in Newfoundland. And we have archaeological records, and not only that, but stories from native peoples, uh, remembered and talked of uh, the violent, blue-eyed white men that had come from across the sea. And so even when Christopher Columbus came, it was part of no surprise. I don't know if you're aware of, um, like Montezuma's expectation that Christopher Columbus, like the foretellings that there had been white men from the sea before, but this probably begins to enter the native record, um, from this Viking contact. Um, there's a great, uh,
This was why they reacted the way they did to Columbus, because they had already had these experiences and they were anticipating their return.
okay, so there is a narrative recorded in, I don't know, the 1930s, that was a firsthand recording from the grandson of the last shaman of the Pecos tribe. And I found it very interesting because it goes into some details about this, and it's probably the most relevant thing to bear on this. But I found it very interesting because he tells that the Pecos people lived, in what is now Pecos, New Mexico, and they spoke the Uto Aztecan language. So think of, Utes who had taken the Puebloan way, and lived in a pueblo, uh, not on the Rio Grande with the Tiwa or Tanoan speaking, um, ancestral Puebloans or Puebloans who lived there, but they were a Ute tribe that had taken that way. So, and I say that because, possibly they had been moving about the country, not on Southwest Airlines, but moving about the country prior to building their pueblo and settling in the Pecos. And the grandfather
Is
of
this the right? Is this the right one? Pecos Pueblo.
no, this is the pueblo of this is Jemez. So I don't I the Pecos people were, the Pecos Pueblo was assimilated probably into the Jemez Pueblo. I'm not sure. Um, that where they were on the Pecos was sort of a trade route of Apaches and the Pecos and other tribes. There's a big cut in the Front Range. The Pecos River like cuts deeply into the Front Range, and so it's not that hard to get into the Rift Valley of the Rio Grande, and so that was a well-trafficked area. And we also compress we compress our history in our minds, but there was a lot of movement that went on for hundreds of years, 400 years before the United States, and French migration and other Western European migration into the Eastern Seaboard caused a lot of havoc. So the Pecos tribe was assimilated into other tribes, maybe the Picuris or the Taos Pueblos. Jemez is over on the La Garita volcano over on the other side of the Rio Grande. But anyway, he recounts in probably when he was an old man. He recounts what he was told by his grandfather, and he says our people were very aware of white men, because white men had come and they had settled and married. They had married into they had married native women and lived here for some time, and they were very warlike, but they did not come to stay. And so after they were here for a time, they turned around and went back. But he said he says that there were many blue-eyed natives, and whenever you saw a blue-eyed native, you knew that that was because they were a progeny of the Vikings who had lived up in Newfoundland. So fascinating. Anyway, to go back to Columbus, or to New Mexico. I mean, many of these conquistadors were secretly Jewish and had to hide their faith, and so if you're living in a country and you believe one thing and you can't express that belief, a natural response is to go somewhere else. And that's a story of many of the conquistadors who
That's the story of the Puritans too, actually, isn't it? It's like they
yeah. I mean, the Puritans were coming from England, and they believed in the Protestant faith, or they did not toe the line of the Episcopalian, sort of recreated Catholic Church that Henry VIII had made, and were looking to come and express their faith. So that's basically the story of the true history of the United States, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, is one of people seeking. We have these phrases, liberty and freedom, and I say that it was people who were looking to move about. There's the liberty part. Seeking freedom, and freedom is that Norse Viking word for the place of the mother, Freya, dumb, your mom's house, and in their mind, what they're looking for is the freedom to express their religion, or maybe to escape taxes. I'm not sure if those are separate things, though.
So there's a parallel here between this idea of wanting to be able to express your true beliefs and going to a place where you can do that. And this is one of the impetus of the conquistadors who are from the lower class.
Yes. And so it's not, it's not a pretty history, but I don't know when I hear, because we said Columbus Day earlier. Some people like to remember this day as Indigenous Peoples Day, but I think we really come to a question at that we grapple with in nation states and political order all over the world, and that is, do we want people to be able to move around, or are they bound? Are they bound to the land? Are they bound by blood? And or are they bound by beliefs that they share with an other group of people or religion? And I'm afraid that when we tie ourselves to this notion of being bound, it is going backwards in a progression of things that we once we know about that we want. And I don't think that anybody wants to go back to a feudal system of being bound to the land, or a feudal system of being bound to a house, or another person. But we also do need to have something in common to share with a group of people. We are mammalians. We are mammals, and mammals are herd animals that need contact, that need social engagement. And um, this is where I think religion comes in, and it's one.
Well, and mobility within any geographical areas always implies some amount of economic stability or freedom, because it always costs money to move. So if you're going to move, you're going to do something. You almost have to be either connected to some sort of economic reality that can allow that, or you have to be part of the middle class, right? I mean, it's not, if you're poor, it's really hard to change locations at all.
Well, there are, when I
Wasn't
hear,
wasn't this the indentured servitude that a lot of the people that came to America, that they came here and they mortgaged themselves as a type of slavery, with the anticipation at the end of a period of time they'd have their freedom, they'd be able to do something, but that was the only way that they were capable of making that move, was to sell themselves into a form of slavery.
well, yes, the indentured servitude was, like a temporal, like a time window of binding yourself to another person. But the only difference between indentured servitude and what we call slavery, or chattel slavery, is a notion that you could be free of it before you died. When we say economics, I often think of economics as a word for that atheists use to describe religious agreements, because um, a lot of neoclassical economics are brought to us by Scottish mercantilists, and for us to accept their values and their interpretations of what people want, or how commerce is, where commerce sits in society. I don't think is always true in every order, and I think that we've come to a point in the world where some of the things that we've accepted as true, that have come from the likes of Adam Smith, and in this vein of that we so traditionally think of economics, you know s- a lot of a lot of the accepted notions that came from there also came from uh, notions of being able to move around, and to impress their religion on other people. Um, when Europeans came to, I mean, even when the conquistadors or the Puritans, when they came over to the Americas and wanted to trade, the conquistadors, Pizarro, who was the conquistador who went down to the Incas, he he took the Sapa Inca, the emperor of the Incas, as his prisoner, and he asked for a ransom. And the king of the Incas thought nothing of it. He was like, "Well, take everything, take everything." And the conquistadors talk amongst themselves, the Pizarro brothers, um, and Arellano. They talk and they can't believe. They say, why would he offer up all of this? And they got to know him very well as they lived with him um, while Inca ran up and down the roads of Peru, today Peru, and were gathering gold and silver to fill a room to a certain level, which is what the ransom was set at. And at one point, um, and now I can't remember the emperor's name, of course. At one point, he says to him, he says, "Well, we can always make more." And it's what would we do if we weren't making beautiful things to trade with each other? And there's a when Americans entered the Mojave Valley and remarked to each other that, oh, that we're getting such a good deal, the Mojave said, well, it's fun to trade. Why wouldn't you trade? It's an evil thing to hoard, because if somebody actually needs something, how could you deny something and not share it?
Now you've got me thinking about circular economies again.
Well, and isn't it interesting to trade, to engage in commerce based on wanting to give something away as to wanting to take and to hoard something? And this this like this goes back to, I think this goes back to both like debt forgiveness and to having societies in which everyone is accounted for. And I also think that it's interesting to go again back to the Inquisition and to things that were happening in Europe and in North Africa and in the Middle East with regards to some of the religions there. Um,
It also gets me thinking about like this idea of starting over, right? We've had these conversations about how do you sit down at a game where everybody's already played and it's really hard for you to get a start. But this was the allure of the new world. It was a place where you could start over, you could start fresh, and not everything had been taken or not everything was owned. And so everybody was somewhat on a level playing field because it was the new world. It was a place where you could start fresh. Do I have that right, or was that sense kind of not real?
I know, I absolutely think you're 100% correct. And this is also why coins, I think this happens on the wake of coins. There are technical innovations that had massive impacts on the way that the world had been run, because there's thousands and thousands and thousands of years that people were much more sedentary. But how did they remain in an area and not have growing like political divides in which people were not taken care of? And I think it goes to debt forgiveness. Are you familiar with Jubilee, the Jewish concept of the Jubilee?
Yeah, every 50 years, this was all debts were forgiven. Everything that had been happened in the previous time period was wiped out.
It may have, so I it may be 50 years now. At one point, I believe it was every year, and it was an annual celebration that was a forgiveness of debts of the year. And at about the time that you see the schism of Judaism to Christianity, I think that there were disagreements amongst the priests or
Oh, the
the
freeing of the debt slaves. Yeah.
yeah. And so it's interesting I mean, where is this notion of the freedom of debts in Christianity.
Well, in this day and age, wouldn't it be in declaring bankruptcy? That's one way to free yourself from debts, I suppose.
Well, in some way, but that is a civil law. Like we've embraced this notion of the separation of church and state. We go back to the Bible, and isn't it Jesus who says, like, a rich man? It's easier for a rich man to for a camel to be pushed.
I think it's something to the effect of it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. Something to that effect.
Yeah, yeah, that's. I tried to get there, but I was always terrible at memorizing memory verses.
Well, you got like entire histories memorized, and I have a random Bible verse memorized. There we go.
Thank you. Well, and think also about the narrative of Jesus. You know, it's he's a sacrifice. He's taking the place of sacrifice, taking the place of Jesus sacrifices himself to pay for our sins, and think about how that works with notions of who's responsible for a debt. And so we also have to think of St. Augustine. The Christian movement was not always one of organization, and after there had been innovations with both coinage and anonymity, and a I don't know, a response to who is responsible for debt and how often debt gets paid. The Christian movement is in many ways a response to this, and I would say also the Islamic faith too. It has very, very it has even more expressed concepts of what interest may be charged and how debts, well, how debts must be forgiven or be repaid.
Right, and I've seen even some of this come into play in our modern world, where I think Bitcoin was declared halal because it doesn't have these entrapments of interest and whatnot. And so Bitcoin being declared halal was kind of a big deal. I think that one flew under the radar of a lot of people, but that could be a big movement in what happens with Bitcoin in the longer term of it being acceptable to the Muslim faith.
Well, and we have this narrative also going back to Europe of the Jews being the banking class because they had different notions of charging of interest. But the while Jews at the time charged interest, it's interesting to go back and look at what the Catholic Church was doing, because the early Catholic Church would give you a loan, and it was a very low interest rate on the loan, but the payment window, like, they give you a loan and it had to be repaid within a month, and if you didn't repay it within the month, there were draconian terms as to what happened to the asset. And and what did the Catholic Church do but acquire a massive amount of wealth and power? And
these being some of the criticisms even that were leveled against the Catholic Church. I mean, this was Luther's argument against the church, that they were essentially just becoming this massive institution of wealth and had lost their way, right? Wasn't that the theses?
I mean, absolutely. And look at the association between the noble class, the classified feudal system that was piggybacked on the Catholic Church. Kings went to kiss the rings of the Pope, and if they did so, they were able to hold on to their lands, and their debt was forgiven, and yet everybody else's was not. And meanwhile, they pointed to interest rates, but nobody bothered to look at um, the loan window and the terms of the terms of what happened if you couldn't pay off a debt. And these are things that we need to be having conversations with. Like even in the United States starts off all well and good. uh, the the fault of a loan was, going back to these notions of economy. Where did the neoclassicists get it right? They said, oh, we should have this notion that's called business, and it should be separated from government, because government always backs government, the church, they always back up the winners. So you can go enter business, and it's the fault of a lender if they made a bad decision. That was their bad business practices, and they can go under, and the people that that didn't pay back their loans, if business goes under, you get to move on with your life. And so there was some notion of debt forgiveness there, but we we have abandoned that. Like, even bankruptcy, while all well and good, put some notion of the expectation of debt forgiveness, or the fault of debt, on the debtor. And once the fault of debts is placed on a debtor, how do they crawl out of that hole? We have absolutely removed.
Well, you go to debtor's prison, right? Isn't that what used to happen?
No, now you declare bankruptcy, and you go on to a UBI, or you go on to.
I don't actually. I thought that there was some places that I saw that there was something where debtors' prisons were being brought back in America. And I remember seeing an article about this and just being kind of shocked and very much dismayed that we might be headed back on this route, because I think you're 100% right that this idea that you could somehow find yourself into debt and never be able to climb out from it is kind of the modern experience. I mean, this idea that your student loans just stay with you forever, can never be wiped away, and that they're this millstone around your neck for all eternity. It's pretty hard thing to think about, especially if you take these out when you're young and you don't really understand what you're getting yourself into.
Well, I would say we have a massive debtors prison system, and it's piggybacked in the narrative of drug use. Because if we're putting people in prison for nonviolent crimes, and even if they still have like expendable income, and they don't owe debts, like, what is the reasoning behind putting them in prison for?
Well, and the 14th Amendment, didn't it? It had that carve out that said slavery was abolished except for, and then there's these listed exceptions on like how you could still have slaves.
Well, the exceptions were actually to do with the native peoples whose lands had been stolen. That
Well,
was
wait a minute. I thought it had something else like in there. It said if you're a convicted criminal or something like that. Isn't there a call out for that? Hold on, I'll pull it
Oh,
up.
there probably is. There probably is. I mean, we love to talk about democracy today, but in reality, it was a republic, and a republic is about, who has, who shares in the political system. And so, uh, debtors debtors were accepted, in many states, maybe not in Georgia. Um, but going back to like, why do we have these, why do we believe in this notion of imprisoning somebody who is, I don't know, smoking a joint, um, or gets caught with an ounce of cocaine or something? These go back to these European notions of, uh, that I think we were trying to get away from. That had to do with a switch of putting, an expectation of fault on the lender as opposed to the debtor.
And of
And
course, I got it wrong by once. The 13th Amendment, yes, here's this clause in it right here. Uh, Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude. That's the. This is not what we were talking about earlier. Indentured servitude. That would have been something different. Except as a punishment for a crime, where you've been duly convicted. So you can still be a slave as long as you're a criminal.
Well, I don't know. 13th, some of the, well, most of the amendments, let's not get into the topic of amendments, but this is interesting. But actually wanted to talk about addiction. Do you know where the word addiction comes from?
This is one you've told me before, but tell me again. Like addiction, this has its roots in something that was pretty interesting.
Um, I think we mentioned it on a show once, but we ran out of time and didn't get to it. And the clock is ticking today. So addiction is Latin for without a voice. It also is interesting, voting means to have a voice, voce, vote, um, vocal. And in Britain, like in Britain, going back to, I believe the late 1700s, maybe like early 1800s or mid 1800s. Actually, it's after the opium crisis and Columbian exchange. Tobacco, drug use. Many of the native peoples were engaged in fairly frequent psychoactive drug use, but that was part of the Columbian exchange, and so you had people who were opting out of going to the workhouses and going to opium dens instead. And if they could not pay their rent, they were addicted. And the addiction did not mean that was not in reference to their drug use. It was in reference that they know if they could not pay their rent, then they didn't get to participate in government, in the election of their representatives in government. So addicted was a result of being on drugs. If you weren't working, then you didn't get to have a voice in government.
So these ideas of participatory government, of whether you needed to have land, be a landed individual, whether you could pay your rents, these have been pervasive throughout the old world.
Oh, yes. Um, pervasive, not throughout the old world, but throughout Europe, and were a
Oh, so the natives would have been distinct from this then. That's sort of where we draw the line, right? Is a lot of, if we're not talking about European, then the Native Americans sort of had a different way about it, right?
absolutely. I mean, they believed, people. Many of what we call tribes are either family or their names refer to a common geographical element that they shared. But they also shared sort of like a broad general religion of the of something they call the Great Spirit, which I think has also been very much incorporated into Protestant notions. I mean, when I think of the Protestant religion and like phrases like, God lives within you, what's different than God lives within you, and God enters through the back of a head to a baby, and is the reason that they have a whirl on their head, and the Spirit suffuses their body and presses all the way through it until they have whorls on their fingertips, and everything that has spiral fingertips like is imbued of the Great Spirit. Like, now that sounds like vaguely Christian, like a vaguely Christian notion, but Protestants certainly grasped onto those narratives of Christianity more so than Catholics or the other branches of the monotheistic culture that came out of the Middle East. But there was something else that I was going to try to get in before we ran out of time. Um,
We're okay. We still got a few more minutes. Go for it. I was just trying to say, like, this participation when you were talking about addiction and being without a voice and having to pay your rent. It just seemed like there was a parallel there.
well, and um, oh, I honestly think that it goes again back to coins. You know, where do coins come from? And we have this. We love to go back to Romans. What's part of that? The Romans and the Greek and the Roman Republic. Well, we we had we came up with this idea. I don't know. Well, coins go way back before that, but it really starts to grow. And what is so peculiar about coins? It gives us this ability to have anonymity, and not only to have anonymity, to pick up and go somewhere else and restart the game. And so it's interesting to see, like, the effects that, or to think about the effects that coinage systems had in the old world, and how that how the I mean, what did conquistadors come, and why were they tyrannical, or um, why were they inhumane to the people here? Is because there was an unbalanced desire for gold and silver here. And what were they going to do with that, but take it back, melt it down, and um, use it to move about the world with some amount of anonymity, but carry value and carry prestige from one place to the other. So um, I don't think that we go back with regards to innovations like coinage, but we need to figure out ways to move about the world, and maybe not get away with being inhumane in the place that we came from before.
Well, it definitely makes me think about that monetary system where money evaporated. I know that you've mentioned it before, and then well, we got exposed to that, so we're definitely going to have to dive into that one as a subject. I think sometime soon, because this idea of money, anonymity, how do you actually play a game where all the pieces are already owned, or can we make circular economies? I think all of this stuff is very relevant to what's happening right now as the world re-envisions money and thinks about whether fiat or Bitcoin or something like this is going to be the next monetary system. We're on the verge of redeciding what this all means for society, and I think it's appropriate for us to continue to look into these subjects.
Yes, well, another day we'll talk about evaporating coins, evaporating money. I look forward to that one. But I enjoyed it today. Happy Columbus Day, happy Indigenous Day, happy Coin Day.
Yep, we'll see you tomorrow.